I never expected something as small as a strand of hair to turn my world upside down. But there it was, long, golden, unmistakably blonde, caught in the drain of my bathroom sink. My hair hasn't been blonde in decades. At 68, the gray that frames my face tells a different story. One of survival, of widowhood, of the quiet strength that comes with age. So when I held that strand in my hand, it wasn't just hair, it was the whisper of betrayal. The first tremor before the ground beneath me began to shift. For a moment, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it clung to my coat when I was out at the grocery store, or perhaps the grandkids left it behind on their last visit. But deep down, I knew better. My partner, Frank, has been living with me for 3 years now. He's a man in his early 70s, charming in a steady way, the kind of presence that filled the silence after my husband passed. Frank was comfort, reliability until suddenly he wasn't. And then there was Dorothy, my closest friend for over 40 years. We raised our children alongside each other, shared coffee and confidences, celebrated milestones, and mourned losses. She has always been part of my inner circle, my chosen family. I trusted her in a way I rarely trust anyone, which is why the hair unsettled me so deeply. It wasn't just a question of Frank. It was the gnawing suspicion that the betrayal might reach further, closer, into a place I thought was untouchable. The truth is, my life had settled into something comfortable before that morning. Frank cooked breakfast most days. We watched the evening news together, sometimes holding hands on the couch. Dorothy stopped by regularly, with her easy laughter and sharp advice that always seemed to cut through my overthinking. Everything felt predictable, safe. And yet safety can be the perfect disguise for danger, can't it? I remember staring at that blonde hair for a long time, feeling my chest tighten. I wasn't ready to accuse anyone, not yet. But something had shifted. That one small discovery cracked open a door I hadn't wanted to open. And once suspicion slips in, it doesn't quietly leave. That was the beginning. The hair in the drain was more than a clue. It was the start of questions I couldn't ignore. Questions about Frank, about Dorothy, and about the foundation I thought I could lean on in these later years of my life. And as I stood there that morning, holding on to something that didn't belong to me, I found myself drifting back to when Frank and I first met, back to the years when Dorothy was my anchor, before doubt crept in, before trust felt fragile. That's where I need to start, if I'm to tell you the whole truth. When I look back on the years after my husband passed, I sometimes wonder how I managed to carry myself through the emptiness. The house was too quiet, the nights too long, and the meals I cooked for one tasted like little more than reminders of what I had lost. For a long time, I thought love was behind me, something reserved for younger people, something I had already been lucky enough to know. And then came Frank. We met in such an ordinary way at a neighborhood gathering, and yet he brought a warmth into my life that felt extraordinary. He was gentle, attentive in ways that mattered, holding doors, remembering the small details of my day. He reminded me what it felt like to laugh again, to feel steady companionship instead of silence. After 3 years together, Frank had become part of the fabric of my daily life. His presence filled the house in a way that made it feel less lonely. Alongside him, there was always Dorothy. She had been by my side long before Frank, for over 40 years. Our friendship had been a constant thread through so many seasons of life. She was there through the sleepless nights when my babies were colicky, through the long afternoons when we watched them run wild in the yard, through the heartbreak of my husband's illness and the ache of losing him. Dorothy was more than a friend, she was like family. The sister I never had. I trusted her with everything. With Frank and Dorothy, I often told myself I was one of the lucky ones. How many people reach their late 60s with both a loving partner and a lifelong friend? I would sit in my kitchen, coffee cup in hand, listening to Frank hum while Dorothy told one of her stories. And I'd feel this deep sense of gratitude. I felt safe. I felt cared for. But safety has a way of lulling you, of making you blind to the cracks until they begin to spread. That strand of blonde hair kept returning to my thoughts. It didn't belong in my sink, in my life. No matter how much I tried to push it aside, it clung to me like an echo. I began to notice small things I had never paid attention to before. Frank checking his phone a little too often. The way his voice softened when Dorothy's name came up. I told myself it was my imagination that after losing so much, maybe I was simply afraid of losing again. But fear has a way of sharpening your instincts, and mine told me that the hair wasn't just a coincidence. The truth is, when you have as much history as I did with both of them, you don't want to believe suspicion could have a place. Frank was my comfort. Dorothy was my anchor. And yet, the thought that they might be connected in ways I couldn't bear to imagine, it began to settle in my chest like a stone. I wasn't ready to face it outright, but I could feel the unease spreading. The hair in the drain wasn't just a mistake, it was a sign, a warning, and little by little, I began to prepare myself for what I might find if I kept looking. That was the moment my gratitude began to shift into doubt. The moment when love and friendship no longer felt as steady as I once believed. And that was only the beginning of what I was about to uncover. It began with little things, things that only someone who lives closely with another person would notice. Frank had always been steady in his habits. He read the paper in the morning, sipped his coffee slowly, and gave me that half smile whenever I fussed about the weather. But lately, something was different. His phone, which he once left lying around without care, was suddenly glued to his side. He angled the screen away when I walked past, as if shielding a secret. At first, I told myself not to be paranoid. After all, I was 68, and maybe I was being oversensitive, but once a seed of doubt is planted, it doesn't stay small, it grows. I began to see more. The way Frank lingered in front of the mirror longer than usual, smoothing his hair, adjusting his collar before he went out. The way Dorothy's name slipped into his conversations more often, too often, like a shadow weaving its way through every story. Each time he mentioned her, something in me tensed. Dorothy, my friend of 4 decades, the woman who had stood by me in grief, who had sat in my kitchen through countless mornings of shared coffee, was suddenly everywhere in Frank's words. He spoke of her garden, her new walking routine, her laugh, little details that didn't belong to him, details that sounded too close, too intimate. I tried to dismiss it, but the blonde hair in the drain refused to leave my mind. It felt like a thread waiting to be pulled. So one afternoon, against my better judgment, I sat down at my computer and opened Dorothy's social media. The first image that appeared took my breath away. Dorothy smiling, radiant, her once dark hair now a fresh, golden blonde. It shone under the sunlight like the very strand I had held in my hand. I felt my chest tighten, as if the room itself had collapsed inward. I scrolled further, my fingers cold on the mouse. There she was at dinners in restaurants I knew Frank liked. posing with wine glasses, her nails manicured, her clothes more expensive than I had ever seen her wear. I noticed the caption's short, playful phrases hinting at joy and indulgence. I noticed how many of these outings seemed to align with nights Frank had come home later than usual. Piece by piece, the puzzle assembled itself, cruel and undeniable. The hair in my sink wasn't random. It was Dorothy's. The woman I had trusted like a sister. The one person I thought incapable of betrayal had left behind her mark in the most intimate space of my home. And Frank, my companion, the man who had held my hand through lonely nights, was no longer just a partner. He was a betrayer, weaving his life into hers while still sharing mine. The realization burned, sharp and merciless. Betrayal wasn't just from a lover, it was from a friend. The kind of double wound that cuts deeper than either could alone. I sat staring at Dorothy's smiling face on the screen, feeling a mixture of rage and heartbreak twist inside me. I knew then that this wasn't something I could ignore. The blonde hair had spoken louder than words, and the pictures confirmed it. I was living a lie. The time for quiet suspicion was over. The truth had revealed itself, and with it came a storm I could no longer hold back. And so, with my heart pounding and my hands trembling, I began to plan what I would do next. It was Dorothy who suggested the cafe. A quaint little place with checkered tablecloths and soft jazz humming in the background. It should have felt comforting. But the moment she walked in, all I could see was the gleam of her new blonde hair catching the sunlight. She looked younger, lighter, almost radiant in a way I hadn't seen in years. And for the first time, that glow didn't feel like something to celebrate. It felt like evidence. We sat across from each other, two women who had shared 4 decades of friendship. Her hands fidgeted with the coffee cup. Her eyes darted from mine to the tablecloth as if afraid to be seen too clearly. I watched her carefully, waiting. Every word she spoke carried a tremor, as if guilt were trapped beneath the surface, desperate to break free but held back by fear. She asked about Frank with a casualness that didn't feel casual at all. I answered slowly, each word chosen like a test. I could feel her flinch beneath my steady gaze. She didn't confess. Not directly, but she didn't need to. Her silence said enough. Her blush when I mentioned Frank noticing her new look. Her nervous laughter when I hinted at routine and predictability. The friendship we had built on honesty now felt brittle, hollow, a stage set about to collapse. That evening, I lay awake beside Frank, listening to the even rhythm of his breathing. Once, that sound had brought me comfort. Now, it felt like the breathing of a stranger who carried another woman's scent. Anger churned inside me, sharp and restless. I had been patient, forgiving, even blind, but no more. The idea came to me with startling clarity. If Frank wanted to play games, I would write the rules. The next morning, I stood in the drugstore aisle staring at rows of beauty products. And there, nestled among them, was my weapon hair removal cream, a quiet, ordinary item, almost laughable in its simplicity. I picked the strongest formula, one designed to strip away even the most stubborn growth. My heart beat fast, but my hands were steady. Back home, I unscrewed Frank's expensive shampoo bottle, the one that promised rejuvenation and vitality. I poured its rich contents down the drain, then replaced it with the harsh cream. The chemical scent was sharp, but I masked it with a few drops of the original shampoo. When I placed the bottle back on the shelf, everything looked untouched, ordinary. But I knew better. The first day, nothing happened. Frank showered, humming off key as always, and emerged looking the same. For a moment, doubt crept in. But by the second day, I noticed it, the thinning along his temples, a softness to his hair that hadn't been there before. He frowned at his reflection, running his hands through it again and again. He muttered to himself late at night, restless, checking the mirror like a man haunted. By the third day, the patches had spread. Small bald spots appeared, scattered across his scalp like tiny betrayals written on his skin. He tried to cover them with careful combing, then with hats pulled low over his forehead. But there was no hiding it. The cream had done its work. I watched him with a calmness that surprised me. A part of me almost laughed at the irony how vanity, the very thing he had been feeding in secret, was now unraveling him. Another part of me felt the deep ache of sadness, because I had never wanted to become this woman, someone who resorted to quiet sabotage. But I had also never wanted to be betrayed. Revenge, I realized, wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming power. For too long, I had been at the mercy of other people's choices: Robert's death, Frank's betrayal, Dorothy's lies. But this act, petty as it might seem, was mine. My decision, my control. As Frank stood before the mirror, panic etched across his thinning hairline, I sat in silence, sipping my tea. A strange calm settled over me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't powerless. The balance had shifted. And as I looked at him adjusting his cap before leaving the house, I knew this was only the beginning. The real confrontation, the one where truth would no longer be able to hide, was still waiting ahead. Dorothy greeted us at her front door with a bright dress and a practiced smile. But I saw the hesitation in her eyes when she looked at Frank. He wore a baseball cap low over his head, desperate to hide the damage already done, though nothing could cover the way guilt sat heavy in his posture. The air was already thick with tension before we even stepped inside. Her dining room was set with care china cups, a plate of sweet rolls, a vase of fresh flowers. It was almost too perfect, as though she believed presentation might disguise the truth. I sat down at the table and let the silence speak louder than any accusation could. Frank shifted in his chair, adjusting his cap again and again, while Dorothy's hands shook just slightly as she poured the coffee. I didn't need to say much. Every time I mentioned routine, every time I spoke of small details, I could feel them tightening. Dorothy's smile faltered when I casually remarked how strange it was to find blonde hair in my shower drain. Frank's hand trembled as he reached for his cup. The truth was there, etched on their faces, spilling out in nervous glances and forced laughter. I watched them unravel without raising my voice. I asked questions as though I were making conversation, but each one was a thread tugged loose. How had Dorothy been spending her time? Why did Frank seem so unusually attentive to her lately, with every gentle prod? The room grew heavier. Dorothy's composure cracked first. Her eyes glossed with tears she tried to blink away. Frank, ever the performer, tried to carry on, but his desperation bled through. He spoke of stress, of confusion, of nothing meaning anything. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about Dorothy. Later, when I pressed him outside the house, he admitted what I had suspected deep down: Dorothy was not the first, nor the only. There had been others, women he swooped in to comfort, to rescue, to charm, only to betray their trust once they had given him everything. A pattern, not a mistake. A history of taking advantage of loneliness and dressing it up as kindness. That truth landed heavier than Dorothy's betrayal. My best friend's weakness had cut me deeply. but Frank's history carved a scar. For years, I had thought I had found stability, a companion in the quiet years after loss. But what I had really found was a man who fed on brokenness, who thrived on the role of savior, only to abandon when it suited him. I stood taller then, even as the weight of betrayal pressed against me. In that dining room, surrounded by the ghosts of laughter and the smell of fresh coffee, I chose dignity over desperation. Dorothy's tears could no longer move me. Frank's pleas no longer swayed me. I walked out with steady steps, leaving them behind with their shame. For once, I wasn't the woman who waited for explanations or begged for honesty. I was the woman who had drawn the line. And as I closed Dorothy's front door behind me, I knew the choice had been made. My life would no longer be defined by betrayal or by the fragile comfort of keeping company with liars. I was reclaiming myself, my independence, my peace, my future. The storm had broken, and I was finally ready to step into the calm that followed. After that day, I knew there was no going back. Not to Frank, not to Dorothy, not to the version of myself who tolerated betrayal just to feel less alone. I closed those doors quietly, but firmly. I called my lawyer and changed my will, removing Dorothy as a beneficiary and leaving everything to causes that mattered more: women who, like me, had once felt invisible. I wanted my legacy to mean something more than bitterness. I sold the house where so much of this story had unfolded. The rooms felt too heavy with memory, too full of echoes I no longer wanted to carry. Signing those papers wasn't the end of something. It was the start of breathing again. With that sale, I gave myself permission to imagine a different life, one where my choices weren't bound by grief or by betrayal. I booked a cruise across Europe, the Mediterranean first, then north toward the Baltic. For the first time in years, I felt excitement about the unknown. Not dread, not suspicion, just possibility. Looking back, I see now that revenge was never really about Frank losing his hair or Dorothy losing her composure. The sweetest revenge wasn't humiliation at all. It was reclaiming my freedom, my dignity, and my joy. At 68, I am proof that it's never too late to begin again. I thought betrayal would break me, but it gave me clarity. I thought loneliness would be my punishment, but it became my liberation. The best revenge, I've learned, is living well. And maybe that's the message I'd like to leave with you. Don't let someone else's betrayal define you. Don't let their choices decide your worth. Care for yourself, protect your heart, and when the time comes, walk away with dignity. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you, share it with someone who might need the reminder. And if you've ever faced your own turning point, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Your story matters too.